Greetings, friends of liberty. Here in England at the moment, Mars Royal Sovereign is of course King George III, who presently, quite unfortunately, is having yet another of his fits of madness. Blue urine dreadful. And the poor fellow frothing at the mouth and writing 400-word-long sentences. One sympathizes with his wife at this pathological prolixity, though with spouses 'tis usually the other way round. But speaking of madness, this brings us to America in the 21st century with its own woke madness. In this well-known book by two authors, Greg Lukianoff, president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression and author of Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship in the End of American Debate, and Jonathan Haidt, prominent social psychologist and author of The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. Haidt and Lukianoff attempt to give us both their own description of the woke madness afflicting American college students, increasingly fragile and unable to cope with the demands of general reality and the healthy disagreement expected in college, and the explanation why this phenomenon is occurring. Now, in days of old, those seeking wisdom in ancient Greece, for example, traveled to the oracle at Delphi, and the authors, no doubt on the suggestion of Haidt, who had written The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Truth in Ancient Wisdom, also somewhat mischievously begin by having us accompany them on a pretend visit to a cave in modern Greece on Mount Olympus. Here they meet not a guru, as one might expect, but instead an anti-guru, who guides them to three great untruths. Number one, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, the reverse of Nietzsche, of course. Number two, always trust your feelings, the opposite of Stoicism. And number three, life is a battle between good and bad people, which I would note is actually sometimes true. The authors believe that the acceptance and consequent practice of these three great untruths, these three woke maxims, explain why young collegians are often acting like such cry bullies. So, for example, Lukianoff noted that, whereas previously it was woke college administrators trying to shut down free speech, of late it has been the very students themselves, illustrating the three great untruths by believing that listening to anything disagreeable or politically incorrect on the quad will make them weaker, that their feelings of disgust at hearing opposing opinions are valid and not indicative of their intellectual intolerance, and the people who say these things, who make them feel bad, are obviously bad people. Now, author Lukianoff himself, at one time when younger and depressed, had found cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, helpful in dealing with his anxiety-inducing and depressive thoughts. And he observed that the very techniques college administrators were using to deal with these anxious students contradicted the successful principles of CBT. And certainly in a general sense, this is true. College officials of all types were and are reinforcing and increasing the anxiety and depression of students by confirming them in their irrational ideas, feelings, and responses. Now, another related way of describing what's happening is when focusing on younger children by mentioning the fact that younger children are actually anti-fragile in a certain way, by which they mean that if you expose them to a reasonable amount of stress, they or their bodies will often learn to adapt successfully. The authors note, for example, that research has apparently found by avoiding peanuts and other potential allergens, modern American parents have actually created in many children an allergy to peanuts. And so they suggest the same principle of corrective applies to the politically incorrect ideas that upset collegiate snowflakes. They also assert that this coddling is partly a problem of progress. What do they mean by this? When mankind went from living in stone-aged caves to living by the millions in cities, more and more people caught contagious diseases, a problem of progress. And thus they assert, as civilization has become more refined and less strenuous, our kids have also become more and more refined and less able or willing to handle stressful situations. Also, from their intellectual toolkit, they employ the phrase concept creep, meaning that certain terms like racist or white supremacist can be and are employed by modern liberals in ever wider and ever more general senses and context, their use essentially expanding. Yet another tool they use metaphorically is the social science version of Newton's third law. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So here, for example, they're claiming that as liberals throughout society become more and more likely to believe in conspiracy theories as happened, such as that Trump colluded with the Russians to win or influence the 2016 election, then also Trump and the conservatives, as happened, were themselves susceptible to believing their own conspiracy, that the election was stolen from the Donald. For every action, an opposite reaction. But their biggest and most important explanation by far is in hypothesizing that the so-called iGen generation, or Gen Z, born in 1995, and the first raised on iPhones and social media, by constantly being glued to their phones, became much different, psychologically, than other generations. They argue that this exposure to online messaging and communities has resulted, according to social science research done, for example, by Jean Twenge, in teens, especially girls, becoming more anxious, suicidal, and depressed. And this research appears validated, among other studies, by the fact that the activities that take teens away from social media, such as playing sports, talking with friends, and actually reading a book, result in less depression and anxiety. And this makes sense to me, since this is precisely what I do to limit online anxiety. So what then are we to make of their theory and their intellectual toolkit that purports to describe and explain the origin of this generation of anxious young snowflakes? The most important thing to realize is that since the authors are liberals, as they say, never having voted for a Republican president or congressman, their understanding naturally ignores the huge and detrimental role that big government plays in damaging society and, over the long term, creating many of the exact ill effects displayed and recounted here. So while they often describe what's happening accurately, their explanations often fail. So, for example, this book was published in 2018 and widely read. Our authors, believing that college administrators were, in their words, unaware of the harmful CBT effects they were perpetrating, should be asked, have these college administrators changed their tactics since? Have colleges in the intervening 4 years started incorporating CBT therapy into their treatment of snowflakes? No, of course not, because they were perfectly well aware of the harmful effects, but evaded them all along. So not only have they not changed, but the problem has worsened because all those teaching these harmful ideologies have no actual desire to change. And so our authors, as liberals believing in big government and public education and the righteousness of morals legislation incorporated in Title 7 and 9, don't see that the main problem is exactly the governmental funding and control of American higher education, which has created over the last century a much more liberal country and population and press and Supreme Court and business climate and the racist and sexist Title 7 and 9 of the Civil Rights Act than otherwise would be the case. This is their first and biggest mistake, and they as liberals can't help making it, just like Massachusetts liberal Horace Mann, who started the virus of public education at the K-12 level back in 1852. They talk, for example, at length about the excess parental emphasis on physical safety nowadays, carried to absurd lengths, so that kids can't even walk to school or bike around their neighborhood. Free play, so important for children's development and creativity, has thus been radically curtailed. And all that despite crime rates being, until recently, at historic lows. Do they imagine that conservatives or libertarians were the ones that create this culture of safetyism in America? And if, for example, universities and the social media that propagate their ideas have taught that whites are intrinsically racist and men intrinsically toxic, why wouldn't college students believe that the world is filled with good people and bad people? And if their professors constantly help them avoid confronting any challenges to their intellectual thoughts and ideas and scorn those who disagree, why wouldn't they imagine that their false ideas and their feelings derived from these are always right? And if their teachers constantly inflate their grades in class and tell them fat people are as beautiful as thin, and that everyone is equally deserving of praise and prizes, and that the most important thing is for them to always feel high pseudo-self-esteem, why would they think, like Nietzsche, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger? Now, our authors, again being liberals, believe, of course, that higher education will always be more liberal than conservative. They citing studies which show that way back in the 1950s, the ratio given then, although it's much higher now, was 3-to-1 liberals, conservatives. But what they ignore is that the governmental influence on higher education, even in the 1950s, was substantial through tax exemptions, both of property tax and philanthropic giving for private colleges, and the massive state aid given to state universities through their legislatures. And the nonprofit status of both types meant that they could give themselves kickbacks in many forms, such as tenure, which is famous for being politicized, and for other things such as higher salaries for teaching what they wanted, further insulating them from the educational choice and judgments of the public, who otherwise would have funded and created more classically liberal colleges. So misunderstanding this fundamental intrinsic process, our authors think the market-driven consumerism of modern colleges is to blame, when in fact the last thing we have in modern higher education, with its huge governmental subsidies, largely nonprofit status and tax exemptions, Title VII and IX compliance mandates, tenure, and governmental accreditation, is a free market. So are these snowflakes a problem of progress? No. They are instead primarily a product of government, through the way that their liberally indoctrinated parents raised them, through the direct liberal ideas they got from society and social media, and finally and very directly through the liberal colleges they attended, all of which reinforced their tendencies in many different ways. From orientation on the very first day, to pronouncements from their woke deans and presidents, and to the indoctrination in their woke classrooms. Now, this is not to say that their iPhones for Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook usage have no effect or aggravating function. But without the last 70 years of liberal political indoctrination of American society, it would be much easier for these young people to adapt and learn coping mechanisms, as many adults have, for these sometimes compulsive activities. Given all this, I'd give this book a B minus, because while it describes the iGen generation well and makes us think deeply about what has caused their intolerance, it misses the greatest single cause over the last 70 years, the huge liberalizing effect of the governmental control of American education. Until next time, I bid you well, and remain as ever the Scarlet Pimpernel.